Now, let me introduce the speaker of the day. Welcome, Mr. Beta Mahatvaraj. Beta lives in Chennai and work in the IT industry. You might think, what is an IT guy doing with all the fishy stuff here? Well, Beta is in aquarium hobby for more than 30 years, and he is very passionate about Indian native fish species that normally you won't see in any aquarium or pet shops. He has a fish room with 15 plus tanks, keeping predominantly fishes from the Western Ghats. Beta have a Facebook page that I recommend all of you to have a look. It's called Meenkaran. In Malayalam or Tamil, the word means the fish guy. And this page have 4.8K followers as of today. Many of his followers are internationally renowned fish taxonomists or freshwater fish ecologists. Beta also work with many of these researchers to solve ambiguous taxonomic or fish phylogenetic problems by helping them getting assembled or providing high quality photos of the live fish in their natural habitats. We have seen many fish speakers who are from an academic or research background, but Beta is an example showing us how your passion and dedication alone in a field can bring you on top of the science and help so much in educating the general public. Watch the chat box in Zoom where I will provide all relevant links about Beta's work while he speaks to you. So welcome again, Mr. Beta, and the floor is yours.
Hey, welcome to everyone. I hope everyone is safe during this waves of COVID that we've been having. So let me start by trying to share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Okay, I think I need to just give me a minute till I sort this out. Okay, so can everyone see my screen? Deepak?
Yes,
is it visible?
Yes, we can see. Thanks.
Let me get into the slideshow mode.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let me start off, right? I've been an aquarium hobbyist for, Deepak, I said 30 plus years, but I have a lot of passion for photography, specifically fish photography. And probably for the last few years, it's been more on underwater photography. But, I'm not covering it as part of this talk. But, we've been speaking about another session to kind of cover just the underwater photography part. But in case you're interested, you can, check out my Facebook page for some of those photos, right? So let me start by showing you some of my photos, right? The first one here, right? There's a snakehead on the screen, a lot of scratches on the glass. So what's happened is, one, the fish is overexposed due to too much light. Another is the focus has gone to the glass, right? Okay, the next photo. It's a bit of an underexposed photo of Manakapuru angel. Here you see there is a glare that's kind of distracting right on top of the fish. Okay, so this is a species of Pangeo from the Western Ghats. Here you can see there's a lot of noise around that fish, right, which kind of distracts you. This is basically a noise due to low lighting. This is a picture of an undescribed Kishtura. It's called the trades Kishtura crimson. Here again, if you notice carefully, the focus of the camera is on the mid part of the body, while the face, which is typically the important part that you want to cover, is actually a blur and it's out of focus. Okay, this is one of the missed moments photography, right? This what happens when you have a slower shutter speed. By the time you click on the shutter, the fish is already moved away from the camera. Okay, so this one is I'm sure people in the fisheries are well know this, the gray mullet. Here you can see that the fish is actually overexposed, so you can't actually see what are the features of the fish or what is the color of the fish, right? On the other end of the spectrum, this is a Gara bicornata, another fish from the Western Ghats. It's completely underexposed, right? So you can see the background of the fish has light, but right in front, which is the main part, it is not. It's quite dark, right? This is just a sample of all the things that go wrong when you do photography, right? So 95% of the time when you're trying to photograph, there are things like this which go wrong, right? Just to say, right, when I'm giving a talk on photography, it doesn't mean that I get most of my photographs right. Just to give you an example of what kind of things can go wrong, right? Now, let's actually get into the talk. So what I plan to do is that I'll kind of take you through some of the very basic things that you would need to know, some gear that might be useful for you that if you want to start on photography. And finally, I can give you some tips and tricks. I show you some samples of work that I've done and tell you what settings I've used. And that's probably gonna get a good foundation for you to start on your fish photography journey. Okay. I mean, the main question is why fish photography, right? Why not take a video of the fish? The photography kind of gives you a point in time kind of view of the fish, right? Whether it is a behavior, whether it is the color and pattern, right? Whether it's an action, for example, you see that there is a tarpon right in the middle, which is actually yawning, while on the left, you see a puffer, which is actually, trying to get at me through the glass. And at the bottom, there is an archer fish, which is actually preying on a cockroach, right? Similarly, on the top right, you see there is a couple of assimilous males which are actually fighting, right? So this is the kind of one attraction of photography, or right? You're actually able to freeze a point in time. You're able to kind of give the features of a fish. You're able to kind of capture the behavior. You're able to capture the color and pattern, right? So this is the basis of what typically we take, right? Other than this, you can use it to document, for example, a growth of from a egg to an adult of a fish, right? Or you can, for example, record the spawning behavior of a fish, right? So there are a lot of reasons why you would want to do fish photography. Probably you're somebody who's an ichthyologist and you want to kind of have a picture which shows all the, say, the morphological features and so on, right? So there are different approaches to that. I'm not going to cover everything, but I'll kind of give you the, the foundational aspects for that, right? So how to get started? Obviously, you need a camera to do photography, right? While I've said, three types of cameras: the point and shoot, the DSLR, and the mirrorless. There are people who take photographs in phones as well, right? I typically avoid phones because, one, they don't handle fast moving objects well, right? And they're also difficult to do post processing because most of them have their own inbuilt processing, which means that sometimes they kind of alter the colors of the fish, or they kind of over sharpen, due to which you have some artifacts, right? So these three are there. Point and shoot, if you want to start out, there's less of a learning curve. I mean, once you buy it, you turn it on, charge it, you can start shooting, right? But the obvious disadvantage of a point and shoot, it is not specifically built for shooting fast moving objects or giving you control over the different aspects, right, when you're shooting, right? So which means that you will be kind of restricted on your journey in fish photography, right? For example, if you're going to try and start photographing fast moving fish like a Beryllius or a Divario or something like that, you're going to be stuck because you'll not be able to kind of change either the shutter speed, for which you need to kind of, for example, you use a higher shutter speed to capture a fast moving fish, or you might want to change the exposure setting, right? So it kind of limits you, but it doesn't mean that you cannot get a good photograph of a point and shoot, right? The other options, right? The DSLRs, which are pretty much standard right now. Anyone who's doing landscape photography to kind of, nature photography, they do use DSLR. So you can use that, or you can go for a mirrorless. So what I use from a camera standpoint, I use a Canon EOS 70D. I also use a Sony a6400, which is a mirrorless. But I mean, I wouldn't stress too much on what camera you should buy and all that. Most cameras are good. What you need to look out for when you're buying these cameras is how well they perform under low light, because that is typically a limiting factor, especially when you're shooting in an aquarium, right? While you have enough light in the aquarium to view the fish, you will not have enough light to actually photograph and capture the detail, or have that light sensitivity, right? So that's one thing that you will need to consider. What about the lens? You can use either a telephoto, but it's kind of limiting because typically fishes are small. I mean, typically when I say aquarium fishes, right, they are typically small. So you are much better off using a macro lens, right? Especially, for example, you want to say look at the fins, right? You want to look at the pattern and so on. It's much better to shoot, using a macro. I use a Canon 100mm macro. So that actually gets me, as close to actually shoot fishes like, for example, Danionella or Brachygobius, which are quite tiny, right? Even to our human eye, they're quite tiny. For example, Danionella is the smallest freshwater species in India, right? So you're never going to be able to shoot it with the telephoto comfortably, right? Third aspect, while it's a third here, I consider as the most important, right? Light is critical to photography, right? If you do not have enough light, you're either not going to be able to capture, or you get a capture which turns out to be too noisy, too blurry, and so on, right? So you definitely need to invest in some flash. Some cameras obviously, or most cameras come with onboard flash. The obvious disadvantage of using an onboard flash is that the flash is actually directed towards the front of the camera, which means that you're typically shooting through glass, which means that you have a layer of the glass of the aquarium, and you also have the layer of water, right? So there is a high chance that when you fire the flash at the glass, you're going to have a reflection, right? Which is not going to work out for you. All right. So this is not, excuse me. I'm in a meeting. Yeah. So next one is obviously the external flash. That's the most ideal way to do it. You can keep the flash on top of the tank, which means that you're lighting the fish from the top. So you're not going to have that problem of having a glare, for example. You're not going to have the problem of your light bouncing back from the glass and so on, right? So if you are forced to use an onboard flash, what I would suggest is you can stick a piece of butter paper, right, which will kind of help you to diffuse that light, right? So it will help you to kind of not have that harsh light effect, right? The other option obviously is the external flash. I extensively use external flash. I use a model called Yongnuo. The Yongnuo is the brand. I use the model 564. There are either you can go for the brand, the ones like Canon Speedlight and so on, or you can go for one of these Chinese ones, Yongnuo or Godox. I haven't found much of a difference, and I mean, it's worked well for me, right? So I haven't had much issue, right? The other one that will be useful is the flash diffuser. So what it does is that it's like pointing a torch at something, right? So when you point a torch, you get a spotlight, right? Typically, that's what you get. That's the effect that you get when you use a flash, right? But what you want to achieve sometime is that you want to kind of light up a larger area, or you want to light it up more softly, right? Because sometimes when you have a very harsh light, and most of the fishes which have silvery scales, right? Like for example, the mullet, the divarios, a lot of other danios, right? You kind of have a reflection of the light from the from the scales, right? So when you use a diffuser, one, the advantage is you can get a more softer light. Another is you can spread out the light more, right? So you can cover more area in an aquarium, for example, right? The last set of accessories that I want to talk about, one is a tripod. 95% of my photography is done handheld, because I like to have that versatility of being able to move across the aquarium at different angles to shoot, because there are a lot of fast moving fishes. But you can use a tripod as well, as long as you're shooting a slow moving fish, or you're able to kind of anticipate what the fish movements, right? That's one. The last one, which is quite invaluable, especially if you are say a researcher or somebody who needs to kind of take photos for the lab is what we call a photo tank, which is basically a small tank which would let you fit your fish in, but it's not an extensive aquarium, but it kind of removes the guesswork of when the fish will come near your screen, near your camera and so on, right? I use a photo tank, especially when I get new fish. So I typically take a photo before I, kind of release them into the aquarium. I take a photo in the photo tank. It helps more as a record. The obvious disadvantage of using a photo tank is one, it's a very restricted space, which means that the fish doesn't typically settle down, right? So it's good enough to capture the features, but it's not good enough to actually sometimes give you the right color or the kind of give you the natural colors of the fish, right? So the obvious disadvantages. But a very big advantage of the photo tank is also that you can carry it around. For example, when I travel to the Western Ghats for my underwater photography trips, I carry a photo tank, so I can just catch a fish, put it in the photo tank, photograph it, and drop it back, right? So I would definitely recommend people who spend a lot of time on the field to have a photo tank. And you can even get away with photographing on your mobile phone when you use a photo tank, right? You can just put a flashlight on top and then shoot with your mobile phone as well, right? So that it kind of gives you that flexibility, right? I'll move on from here. This is more on the equipment, but there are some terms that we need to know, right? We don't have to go into too much depth, but we kind of have to have the basics right? So one term that you will often hear is aperture. So what it means is the opening of the camera lens, right? So it's simple like a pinhole, right? If you have a larger hole, you let in more light through that. If you have a smaller hole, you let less light move through that, right? But the aperture kind of has an impact. So when you have a small pinhole, for example, what happens is that there is less light which comes in, right? Which means that your constraint becomes light. You can get more objects in or more depth of focus, but you'll only get less light in, right? So we will talk about the later when I show you some samples, right? So as I said, when you look at the picture here, right, it's basically a juvenile soulfish, right? And you'll see that it's a very odd fish. It's a very difficult fish to photograph, right? Because it's a very flat fish, so it doesn't actually line up to the camera, right? So which means that because it is not say a flat fish that can line up, it means that you will have a challenge getting the entire fish in focus, right? So what I've tried to get here is the main features of the face, its gill cover and its fins, right? So and if you see, after a point, right after the fins, you can see it is fading off, right? It is blurry, which means that you basically lost focus after that point, right? That is what aperture does, right? So in this case, if I had used what you'd say a larger aperture, which means that a larger opening of that hole, which lets the light in, I would have lesser part of this fish's face in focus, right? But if I go right up to f22, then I will get more of this fish in focus. For example, I've used f16, which is, from a focus standpoint, it can go for a lot of depth, but I've had to use a lot of light, to compensate for the smaller opening of the camera lens, right? So, hope this is clear, but, as we go on, probably when I show you the samples, you might get a better understanding, right? So when you see these f-stop numbers, don't get alarmed on your DSLR or mirrorless. Just remember that 1.4 means that the lens is open to its maximum, right? And the f-stop f22 means it is at its minimum, right? If you want more depth of field, you move to towards f22. If you need less detail or rather less depth of focus, then you move on to f1.4. I'll show you a few more examples of that as well, right? Let's move on. Okay. As I was talking about depth of field, right? It's basically the part of the image that is in focus. All right. So as I said, if you want more of the object or the fish to be in focus, as in this case, you need to move on to the smaller aperture, which is like towards f22, right? So let's look at this photo that I took of a Schistera crimson. You can see the focus, right? The depth of focus is quite shallow, right? So only till the eye you can actually see that the features are well defined and it's sharp, right? Post that, it is actually blurred out, right? So going by that example that I spoke about in the last slide, if I wanted to actually capture more of the pattern that's there on its body, I should have gone for a smaller aperture, right? But I would have had to bump the light, right? For example, you can see the shadow that's at the bottom of the fish due to the external flash that I keep on top of the tank. I would have actually had to increase the intensity of the flashlight to actually try and capture the rest of the part, right? If I went for towards f22, right? The another concept that you need to understand is the sensitivity of the camera sensor, right? For example, if I don't know, if you're part of the older generation, some people would have used the the cameras with the film rolls, right? That's where the ISO started, but then we have a slightly different problem when it comes to the digital photography. We have something called as noise, right? So you'll see that one of the samples that I showed right before we started the presentation, you would have seen that there's a lot of noise, right? So if I wanted to photograph, for example, this photo that I have here is something that I photographed underwater in Nagumbe, right? And I was shooting at ISO 6400, which is pretty high. But then just imagine I'm shooting in a forest and I'm shooting underwater, which means that there is very less light penetrating into the water, right? And still I need to keep the fish in focus, which means, like I spoke earlier, if you remember what we spoke over the aperture, I had a smaller aperture so that I could have the fishes in focus, right? So I had to bump up the ISO, right? Normally when I shoot fishes, I will keep the ISO as 100, but when I shoot underwater and I don't have external flash, while it's an option, it is an expensive option, so I don't have it currently, then I would have to bump up this, right? But what is the, as I said, what is the disadvantage is that you get a more noisy photo, right? If you look closely at the photo, if you see the area where right behind the fish, you can see a lot of grainy noise, right? I don't know, probably a different way to put it, but you can see it is noise, right? So this is the ISO, right? So these factors typically are what you need to consider when you do fish photography, right? Like for example, if I'm shooting that Schistera on the screen, do I need to cover the entire fish, right? Do I need the details for the entire fish, right? So there is a trade-off, right, that you'll have to balance, right? So when I shoot in the manual mode of a camera where I can control the shutter speed, right? That is how fast it captures, right? So the faster shutter speed, what happens is that you let lesser light come in, right? So how would you compensate that, right? You can compensate it by increasing the sensitivity of the camera sensor, which means I bump up the ISO, right? Or I can also have a larger aperture, which means that while I'm clicking it faster, I have more light coming in because the camera lens's opening is bigger. But the disadvantage is shallow depth of focus, right? Which means that only a smaller part of the fish can be in focus. And I'll show you how to kind of manage those situations through the next slides, right? So I'll show you some examples so you can kind of get an understanding of what I'm talking about, right? So this is a photo of a Rayamas, a predatory fish, and a very fast moving fish, right? Right from the way it looks like you can call it the freshwater barracuda, right? It's a very, very fast moving fish, right? So here, what I did is that I used an aperture, around f11, which allowed me to kind of capture the detail for most of the body, right? I also slightly bumped up the ISO. I typically shoot at ISO 100, but I increased it to 200, right? And finally, the shutter speed, something that I wouldn't recommend, 1/160, because it's not ideal for fast moving fish. But what I typically do is that once I start setting up my camera and flash, I immediately don't start clicking, right? I typically observe for the swimming pattern of the fish to see which parts of the aquarium does it swim fast, which area does it come to rest, because typically it comes to rest where it feels it is safe, and then I position my camera there, right? So that's how I was able to get away with that, that slower shutter speed. But typically, unless you're shooting any slow moving fishes like gobies, snakeheads, right? Do not go for a slow shutter speed, because typically, as I showed you an example right at the beginning, if you shoot like that, the fish action would have changed, and I never would have been able to catch this action of the gape of the Zerayamas, right? I'll show you a few more similar examples, right? Okay, so this is a Channa Gachua, is one of our dwarf snakeheads, right? And I was trying to shoot it actually eating those pellets that you see floating, right? Basically, it's food, right? Again, right? It's again anticipation. I've used a very slow shutter speed, right? Again, I bumped up the ISO to get more light in, but I still had kind of smaller aperture of f11 so that I can still get the detail, right? So you can see here, right? Because the fish is kind of parallel to the camera, even without a smaller aperture, I'm able to capture all the details of its jaw, its gill cover, all the skin folds, right? Even its nostrils, everything I'm able to do it, right? So it's a lot of decision making that happens when you do fish photography. And it's also dynamic, right? Like sometimes I go and sit in front of the tank for 1 hour and the fish doesn't like to turn up. And typically all my tanks have driftwood and plants, and so that they don't have to see my face unless they want to see my face, right? So it's kind of a thing where it's a waiting game, like just like how you would spend a whole day fishing and not get something you wanted. Similar to that, you would spend probably 3-4 hours trying to photograph a fish, but you might not get it, right? So you need that patience to kind of anticipate what the fish will do, right? So you need to wait and observe the fish to see their behavior to do that, right? Okay, I'll show you another example. Yeah, I think this is probably the most popular fish from India, right? At least in the ornament industry, Sayadria denisoni. So I had 2 fish lined up, right? And you can see that I still was able to get some detail, not good detail, but some detail of the fish behind it, because I used a smaller aperture, right? Again, it's a fast moving fish, but again, if you anticipate where it's moving, then you can actually get away with, as I said, a smallish, slower shutter speed as well. Okay, so another action shot, right? This is again the Dawkinsia similis, right? And I was able to again shoot it, but about a higher shutter speed, and a smaller aperture as well, right? So I'm able to kind of get detail for most of the body, but you can see most of the caudal fin is not in focus, right? You can see it fading away. And it's also the part of flash not able to kind of cover the background, right? Because it's more of a spotlight. I was not using a diffuser, right? So a lot of people ask me, how do you get this spotlight effect where only the fish is in focus? It's by making sure that you're not lighting the background, you're only lighting the fish. Like for example, if you divide the depth of your tank, right? Like say my typical fish tanks are 2 feet, right? I need to do most of these shoots when the fish is around 3 to 4 inches away from the front glass, right? That's when I'll be able to capture a shot like this, right? With the background either being dark, right? Because it is not being lit, right? This is a very useful technique because you can see all the features of the fish without any distraction, right? I mean, the whole point of that photography is the fish. So you have the fish in focus. You can see all the details of its face, its eyes, its scales, right? The whole, even the lateral line you can see in the photo, right? So that's the beauty of when you do that spotlight effect. Okay, few more examples. Okay, I think this is an undescribed aborigines from a northeast. But again, right, slow shutter speed because they're typically not fast moving fish unless they have not settled in, right? So when the fish settles in, they typically, because they are hill stream fishes, they like to sit on flat rocks and so on, right? So I was able to kind of capture the face part of it. So even with f14, because you see it's a very, very long fish, only the front portion of it is in focus, even with f14, because it's not parallel to the camera, right? It's basically almost facing me in a kind of a diagonal angle. Okay. And again here, if you see, I bumped up the ISO for 400, right? Probably because I didn't have enough light, for this photo. All right. Okay. This is a photo that I actually took in I think 8-inch tank, and it's typically challenging. For example, this is the photo tank that I was talking about. So this fish was pretty big, so it is quite challenging. This is a Pterocryptis, right? It's a scisaurid catfish. Again, because it's a photo tank, if you see the shutter speed, very small shutter speed, but very high aperture, right? So I was able to kind of get most of the features, was able to light it. But as you can see, because it's a photo tank, it's very difficult to do a spotlight effect because the depth of the tank is only around 6 inches or so, right? Which means that if I don't use a spotlight, more or less you can see what is in the background. But even for this photo, if you see, I have used a slate rock, I have used some sand at the bottom, so that it kind of gives natural feel. So typically, if someone sees it, nobody believes it that it was shot in a 8-inch long tank, right? Okay, so we'll go back. One thing you would notice is when ISO 100, right? When you shoot in ISO 100, you'll hardly see any noise on the screen, right? So you don't see any of those artifacts at all, right? Okay. This is probably the most expensive, rare, and sought after fish in India. It's a Channa Barka, very, very beautiful snakehead. So I was actually trying to capture the kind of the iridescence of its the caudal fin, right? So this is a bit challenging because they are a fish which once you go near the tank, they want to come and come stand right next to your face, right? So I had to do some maneuvering to actually kind of get a photograph its fin while it's moving. Again, right, you will see that most of my my shutter speed is on the lower side. As I said, it's because more of the anticipation, right? And typically, till you have have good practice, you've done some work, I wouldn't suggest shooting at this speed handheld, because typically you have a lot of shake when you're doing handheld photography, right? And even a small movement can cause that blur and you will not get any detail, right? And one of the tips that I can give you to do handheld photography is what I do is that I hold the camera quite close to my body, and I make sure that my elbows are supported by I can say the side of my waist. So it's basically that I don't have much movement other than the forearms, right? The elbows kind of stuck to my waist, to the side of my body, which kind of gives me some stability, right? So, and I also support the bottom of the camera with typically my left hand because I'm a right-hander, and that kind of gives some stability to kind of shoot photos at lower speeds, right? But till you get used to it, I would suggest use a tripod or use a higher shutter speed, like anything above 1 by 1 by 250 or something like that. Okay. This again, right? The Mudskipper. This is the Dwarf Mudskipper from the Sundarban mudflats. Ferriothalmus novum radiatus. This is actually shot outside water, right? While since they are kind of amphibious, this fellow is actually sitting out of the water when I shot this, right? But again, Mudskipper being slow moving in most cases, I was able to go with a smaller, slower shutter speed. But I wanted to get more detail because it was when you focus typically on its mouth, you kind of lose focus on its eyeballs typically, right? Because it's got a kind of that protruding kind of eyes, kind of like a buggy eyes, right? So which meant that I had to use a kind of smaller aperture to kind of get more detail on it. Okay. Yeah, this is again a close-up shot of a Channa's tuatai. You can see that again, I was able to get away with kind of a larger aperture, f9, because the fish is parallel to the camera, right, to the lens, which means that I don't have to worry so much about the depth of field because there is not much body detail that I need to cover other than probably the 2 or 3 inch depth of the fish, right? So if you can see that with this setting, I've been able to get a very clear detail of the scales, right, including the iridescence, the eyes, the nostrils, right? So we can get a very clear view, right? So again, as I said, right, a lot of this requires planning. As you photograph, you probably, when you start, 95% will be bad, right? And slowly your good photos will increase because once you have a look at that fish, you decide quickly what aperture should I use, what shutter speed do I use, what ISO should I use, right? When you're starting out, you can go for 2 modes. You can either go for the shutter priority mode, which means that you set the shutter speed, the camera sets the aperture, and set the ISO in auto, right? The other option is, because you want to decide on how much of detail you want to capture, you put it on aperture priority mode, which means that the aperture is decided by you, the shutter speed is decided by the camera, right? Only do this for, I would say, slower moving fish, because typically I've noticed that in order to get the most amount of light, the camera will move towards a slower shutter speed and you will either miss the fish because it moves out of the frame or you get a very blurry frame, right? Okay. This is another type of Agaricus, probably Kempii, I'm not sure that it's been described. Again, this is a very long fish, it's around 6 inches. And while it was sitting on a rock, I had to kind of cover the entire body, right? Because this picture actually had to, eventually went into some magazines for publishing, right? So I used f16. So thankfully the fish is not directly facing me, and most of the body just had a curvature, which means that I could still kind of manage most of the detail in this photo. Right? As I said, if you can see here, I've used diffused lighting, so you can see even the background, the rocks that I use in my aquarium can be seen, right? And I don't know if you notice that there is a small, not a small, there is a Sicyopterus which is sitting right between the rock, spying on me, right? Okay. Finally, right, this is the most challenging photography experience that you will have. This was shot in I think this is shot in Amsterdam in a public aquarium. And this puffer, when I'm shooting, the problem is that the fish was moving fast. And also the typical challenge that you have when you are shooting in a public aquarium is that you don't have enough light, right? You don't have the option of using an external flash, right? So, but then the fish is also moving fast, and I actually wanted to, capture, its mouth and its, large teeth. So if you notice the setting that I've used, in order to maximize the amount of light, I've kept the camera lens opening big, which means I've used a larger aperture, right? f5.6. I still kept the shutter speed at 200 because the fish is moving fast, but then I bumped up the ISO to 3200, right? So what is the trade-off here? The trade-off here is that I was able to get enough detail of its mouth, which is what I wanted to capture, right? And it is well enough to kind of indicate that it's, you can make it out that it's a puffer. But the trade-off is that if you see to the right of the image, right outside its mouth, right, to its right, you can see the noise that has been created by using a higher ISO, right? So it's always a trade-off. It's a very challenging situation to shoot in public aquariums and areas where you don't have external flash, especially if you're shooting handle. This was short handle, but yeah, I mean, this is something that you can challenge yourself with, right? Go to if you don't have an aquarium at home, go to a public aquarium and try it. Definitely, it will help you, kind of sharpen your trade, right? Okay, I think this is the last sample that I had. Post this, I have some, kind of tips for you guys. First, right, let's look at that photo. I'm sorry for how crude it is, but basically, I wanted to, when people ask external flash, they're wondering where should you place it. So I just put a clip art there to show that you need to kind of place it right above the tank, but not to the back of the tank, right? You don't want to backlight your fish. The lighting for the fish has to come from the front and top, right? Not from the front of the viewing area. I'm saying from the front side, from the front half of your aquarium, so that the front of your fish is well lit, right? And how do you place it? Obviously, you cannot keep it on water. So typically, what I use is that I have a strip of glass, which is basically a low-end glass. I don't know what they call it in different countries. I think we call it ultra clear or something here. So I keep that on top of the tank. Then I keep the flash on top of it with the diffuser or without the diffuser pointing downwards, right? Wherever I want to shoot, right? The first point here, right? Obviously, as I said, avoid backlighting, because when you do backlighting, the shadow of the fish falls in front, which means that unless you wanted a kind of a silhouette, kind of an image of your fish, it's not a good way to show the features of a fish, right? Because it doesn't show the detail. The second point is basically, as I said earlier, unlike when you're shooting something in your garden, right? You are shooting two layers, right? One is the glass and one is the water, right? If those two are not clean, you'll end up like a photo that I showed you right at the beginning, right? Where the glass is all scratched up, and I mean, I couldn't use that photo because even though the fish was healthy and good, I kind of, anybody who sees it gets distracted by all those scratches on the glass, right? And also, when you use autofocus, what happens is autofocus works on contrast, right? Contrast between your foreground and the background, right? And typically, when you have on the glass things like dirt or scratches and so on, when it doesn't autofocus, it kind of hunts and it kind of fixes the focus on the scratch instead of your subject, which is the fish, right? So typically, you'll have to avoid it, right? What is the other option of doing, avoiding? Like I have a lot of my aquariums have scratch. So how do I avoid that, right? Two ways of doing it. One, you use manual focus, which means that instead of letting the camera, kind of hunt for the focus object, you focus it manually on the lens, right? So you use the viewfinder, look through it, and figure out where you want to focus, right? Obviously, that requires a lot of patience. It requires a lot of some amount of kind of training to kind of figure out how to do that. But that is something by which you can avoid the focus on the glass and instead focus on the fish. All right, so you can kind of figure out how to do that. And typically, what I do a water change a day earlier so that the water is clear. I also do not feed the fishes before photographing, because what happens, two things, right? One, once the fishes feed, they're no longer interested in you, so they're not going to swim in the front of the tank looking for food. Second is, once you feed, either they're going to create waste, because some of it is going to, uneaten food is going to spoil the water, there's going to be dust, or they're going to be producing waste, which is going to, again, you're going to spend a lot of time during post-processing to kind of clean up that image, right? The next step is obviously the observe the fish's swimming path. I think we already discussed it, but it's very important, right? Don't right away go and try and photograph the fish. Leave it time, see, observe how it is swimming. Where does it typically display? Like, for example, a male fish typically will display wherever the females are, right? Probably that's the right place for you to kind of set up your camera if you want to capture the display of the fin edge display of a fish, right? Next one, set up the external flash before you actually do the photography. Like, don't do when you suddenly go and keep the flash on top of the tank, fishes are going to get scared and you'll end up wasting a lot of time. So what I typically do is that if I go to photograph a tank, half an hour before that, I'll go place the flash on top of the tank, put it on sleep mode, and then when I can activate it from the the camera, right? Next one is, I mean, these are things that I've experienced. When you're using flash, they consume a lot of battery, right? So make sure you have additional batteries on hand, because you would be kind of trying to photograph a sequence and suddenly you're left without no battery and you've lost the sequence, right? So make sure that you have additional batteries in hand. Ensure your camera batteries are charged and you have storage cards have enough space. A lot of times what have happened for me is that I'm all ready to shoot, the external flash is kept on top, the batteries are charged, and my storage card is still on my computer because I downloaded some photos from my last shoot on the the computer, right? So which means that you kind of again lost that moment, right? So these are some tips that I'm giving based on the mistakes that I've made. It's not that I've stopped making those mistakes, but I do it at a lesser frequency right now. Okay. The other tips, right? Typically, you have multiple formats that you can shoot in. One is the raw format, which is the unprocessed format. Typically, point and shoot cameras do not allow you to shoot in raw. That's one of the disadvantages of a point and shoot. But the advantage of a raw file format is that you can easily manipulate it later because it's a non-destructive format, unlike a JPEG. Because when you try and correct a JPEG, there's usually some loss, right? Loss in quality, right? But when you do it in raw, because it's kind of a non-destructive format, you can do the changes there and then bring into, for example, Photoshop, and if you want to do some cleanup, you can do it, right? So my typical process is to shoot in raw as well as JPEG, right? And I preview the JPEG. If I don't like it, then I kind of delete both the raw and JPEG files as well, right? The next tip again I covered, when you want to cover a larger area, like for example, you want to shoot a larger fish, right? Because there are some larger snakeheads. You can either use a flash diffuser or you can use multiple flashes with flash diffusers, right? So that you can kind of have equal lighting, for the full body of the fish, right? So that's something that you have to kind of think about. Third one is very important to me because a few years back, I lost a lot of my fish photographs because I put it on hard disk and hard disk crash. Right? What I do is I have like a 2 terabyte space, right? So I load it to drive so that it's safe there. Sorry, not my camera. I can from my computer, my laptop, my phone. There is no issues with that, and there is very less, right? At least I haven't heard of any issues with that, right? So you can think of that, especially if you're worried about the cost of saving those. Pick up which are your most important photographs and store it there, right? So you can always have a backup. What are the others? Yeah, as I said, use a tripod either when you're shooting through a photo tank or when you're shooting slow moving fishes. So you can see actually, this is a Labuka fasciata, right? The fish that you see here is from a very beautiful fish, similar to your hatchet fishes that come from the Amazon waters, right? So this is shot right after photo tank. As you can see, it's a very it's not a very depth. It has a very shallow depth. So you can carry it around, put it in your bag, take some stones from the stream, put the fish, photograph, release it back, right? So very quick and dirty way to photograph on the field. But the obvious advantage is that because they are freshly collected, they don't lose color, right? So it doesn't It's not like you take it, you make your lab, you know, kind of do that for in situ, that you can capture you know, the color. So even when you're writing a description, you can, you know, kind of use it as a reference to say what is the color, you know, what is its color when it is collected and so on, right? Okay, so I'm going to skip the shoot handheld part of it because we already covered it. Yeah, and importantly, right, a big problem that I have, as I said, that when I want to shoot one fish, I typically spend like an hour in front of the tank, sitting with the camera, and it can wear you out, especially your wrist, right? So make sure that you do some stretching, but away from the tank, so that you don't scare the fish. But it's very important. There are times when I spend a lot of time in front of the tank photographing, and I'm struggling to get off the ground, right? Or struggling to move my limbs because it's you know, it's gone dead, right? So make sure that you kind of do some stretching before, you know, during your photo shoot as well. Last step, as I covered earlier, right? Work with a higher ISO. So whenever you can't use an external flash, like in a public aquarium situation, bump up the ISO. At least you will get the fish, probably not with the best quality, but at least whatever you want to capture, you can capture, right? So this is pretty much the tips that I have more on the photography part. This is more on the processing of your photo, right? So if you see on the top, there is an archer fish that is raw, that is unprocessed, right? How I shot it, right? So when you can see some scratches that are there on the glass, right? You can see there is some overexposure on the top of the fish. On the bottom is the actual fish after processing in Photoshop, right? You can see better detail there. There are no distractions in terms of dust or scratches and so on, right? So this is the advantage of processing. Obviously, I've seen also people processing the fishes so much that it nowhere looks like how the actual fish is, right? You bump up the reds and blues and greens so much that, you know, it kind of looks like something that you developed in the lab with, you know, dyes and so on, right? So try and avoid that. One of the ways to do that is also having a color calibrated monitor, so that you can get more accurate colors when you're processing it, right? And you're not going to bump up the you know, the saturation of the colors too much, right? Okay, what options do you have? There are plenty of options to do the image editing software. I'm going to be I'm not going to be very prescriptive. I'm going to talk about the ones that I've used. Affinity Designer, which is free, not free. You have a trial version that you can use. You also use Lightroom and Photoshop. I prefer Photoshop more because, I mean, I've been working on it for many years, like around 20 years, because I started out as a graphic designer. So I continue to use it, but I mean, there are a lot of tools in the market that you can, you know, try and use for your processing, right? And typical problems that you have, dust or scratches and all that, you can use, you know, noise removal, which is one of the filters that are typically available, or a healing tool to kind of remove all those, you know, aberrations in your photo so that it doesn't distract, right? Right. And coming back to that point, as I mentioned, right, make sure your computer monitor is color calibrated. Last, as I'll go to the raw format, right? As I said, it's the best format to shoot in, so that you can do all those processing pretty easily, right? Finally, you know, add some visual watermark, especially if you are posting it online. Many of my friends have run into problems where, you know, their photographs have been used in publications, or traders have used for commercial use without their permission, right? So make sure that you do add a watermark, but make sure. But I also seen watermarks which look bigger than the fish, right? Don't do that, right? You're actually trying to show the beauty of the fish and not your watermark, right? So try and strike that balance, so that one, you kind of safeguard your, you know, copyrights, but also you're able to show the fish's beauty as well, right? So I'm pretty much done with my presentation. Deepak, can we go into questions? I have a slide with all my social media links and all that, in case you want to follow me.
Yeah, thanks for that last slide. So thanks very much, Beta, for delivering an excellent talk. And as Sia mentioned before, this is the part 1 of his talk. There will be another talk by Beta focusing on the underwater photography. So typically, how would you go into the wild and take your camera under the water and capture the fish with its natural habitat. So today's talk was focusing on the fishes on captivity in aquariums. And thanks to all who joined today for the talk. Before we go to discussion, please provide us with the feedback of today's talk. I'll put put the link in the chat box now. If all of you can spend a minute on providing the feedback. And we are always looking to expand our coordinator network. So if you can help us circulate our talks, we would like to hear from you. Just send us an email to afstalks@gmail.com. So let's move into the discussion part. We have 15 minutes for discussion. Please use the hand raise feature if you have a question to the speaker, and we'll give you a chance to speak. If possible, you can also type your question in the chat box so everyone can read and understand your question. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And while that, I have written a few questions for Beta. So let me allow the participants to unmute themselves. Yeah. So many of your photographs have this dark background, and you explain why it is. You have when you use a spotlight or something. But do you ever use tanks with the background painted black or something? I've seen that many times people use it. Do you use that technique anytime to make sure you get the photos what you desire? Sorry, you're mute, Peter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So actually, most of my tanks do have black background, but definitely that's not the reason why I get that black swan, because mostly even behind the fish there'll be driftwood, there'll be plants and so on in my aquarium, right? So it's more of the spotlight, right? But what you can do is when you're using a photo tank, definitely a black background will help, but be careful because it's a double-edged sword. What I would suggest is use acrylic inserts instead, right? For example, I was trying to photograph a black labio, right? Try and imagine shooting a black labio against a black background, right? It's pretty much a black photo, right? So what I would suggest is using an acrylic insert. So depending on the color of the fish, for example, you want to shoot a black fish, use a white acrylic insert. If you want to shoot a silver color fish, use a black insert, right? So you can do pretty much that. Even for one of my photo tanks, I also have kind of one of those aquarium backgrounds as well. The 3D kind of styrofoam backgrounds that are there, I use that as well, right? So, I mean, there are a lot of options. You can try all those. It's more of what works for you, what kind of fish you're using, what's the depth of your tank, and so on.
Yeah, from that response, actually I have answered. There was a second question with me about fish that is dark or black, right? So would you think when you have a black fish, you probably need a higher ISO to get all the details, because it's dark, and do you think that's one reason you may need to use a higher ISO?
That could be one reason, right? You could use a higher ISO, but you can also achieve it by using a flash which kind of lights up the front of the fish, right? As I said, when I place the flash, it's in the front half of the tank. Obviously, if the fish comes right up to the glass, you cannot shoot it, right? Because then the shadow of the fish falls on it, right? You have all these options to bring light into the camera. A slow shutter speed means higher exposure time, you can increase more light. You can keep the camera lens open larger, which means more light comes in. You can bump up the ISO, which means that it can absorb, the camera sensor can absorb more light, right? So you have all these options. For everything, there is a trade-off, right? If you use a bigger aperture, shallow depth of focus. If you use a slower shutter speed, you can't capture fast moving objects. right? If you bump up the ISO, you get noise, right? So which trade-off are you comfortable with? Which compromise are you comfortable with? That's what you'll have to pick, right? It's more about that, I would say.
Yeah. So now this question applies to all beginners, maybe, and from my experience as a beginner, you when you are so many passionate about doing photography, you get a camera and you really don't know what actually you need, and you'll start realizing that after getting into it, start taking more challenging photos, and then you realize, oh, I would have need a camera with that setting or this setting. So what will be your preference, especially with, I think with ISO, you can, if you think about uh, people who take pictures of the sky in the night, I have seen, you need cameras like, ISOs with like 18,000, 20,000, and probably would be expensive as well. So for you, or for the, fish photography underwater or in an aquarium, what would be the minimum settings or features you would require for a camera as an advice for the beginners?
I would say don't spend too much money on the main camera, right? Spend more on the lens, because that is what gives you the detail, right? So I would say keep a smaller budget for your camera, keep a higher budget for your lens, also add in that external flash, right? The lens is where all the magic happens, right? Yes, you have problems with sensitivity and with lower end models, but just imagine, like, if I go for a full frame camera and I spend a lot of money, I can actually circumvent that problem by buying a flash, which costs much lesser money, and I can light up the subject, right? So typical aquarium photography scenario, I would say spend less, right? Don't worry too much about light sensitivity and all that. Put that money for the flash and specifically the macro lens, right? If you go for underwater photography, yes, definitely, because um, everything is more expensive when you go to underwater photography, right? So for a long time, I've been shooting on a point and shoot underwater camera, and only in the last couple of years, I moved to a mirrorless, right? So definitely, right? For if you're going to be photographing more as a hobby and more on your aquariums and all that, as I said, the formula would be simple. Probably spend double of what you would spend on your camera body, and don't buy camera if it's specifically for fishes. Don't buy the camera with the kit lens. They sell you with a lens. Buy it with the body and buy the lens separately, because if you're just going to use, for example, I want to use it for landscape photography, I want to shoot portraits, I want to shoot my kid, I want to shoot my fish, then it's fine, because you get a versatile lens which comes along with the camera, and it kind of zoom in and out and all that. But if the purpose for which you're buying is shooting fishes, then I would suggest that you don't do that, right? You only buy the camera body, and then you buy the camera lens which is suited for your requirement, which is typically, I would say, a macro lens for shooting fishes, right?
One last question from me. When I do my photography, I'm not a big fan of actually processing the images, and because of the fear that it would takes away the originality or authenticity. But I do some processing, but not extensively. I don't put too much. Try to keep the original, whatever it captures from the camera. But I like the comparison what you showed, and it doesn't, it's not exaggerated in any way. It kind of looks like bringing back what actually it is. So when you work with the processing softwares, what are the do's and don'ts? What tools you would say, maybe stay away from those tools that will probably takes away the originality, and what are actually more useful than others?
Yeah, I think one is that your interpretation of color, right? Like, when as a human eye, you cannot replace the camera lens with the human eye also, right? The human eye has a certain perception of color, and when you do the the monitor calibration, or you want to kind of do the processing, it becomes very important that you kind of try and replicate what you saw, right, in real life, right? even that changes, right? For example, a fish that is in sunlight looks different from a fish which is in different color temperature, right? Like for example, typically in freshwater aquariums we use the kind of neutral 6500 Kelvin color temperature, right? Which kind of gives you a very kind of warmish kind of color, right? So it's very difficult to kind of judge what color is that fish, right? So that takes some observation, right? If you've seen the fish in the wild, you have a reference on how it looks, right? So that is why more and more my interest has gone into underwater photography, because I can shoot how they would be in the water in their in their habitat, right? It is very challenging, I'm not saying I'm not guilty of over processing. There are a lot of images that I've over processed, and then for example I process it in my in my computer and post it, and then I look at that photo on my phone and it looks like, oh my god, this looks like I've kind of really lit up fabulous looking fish, right? But it might be very different in my computer. Then there's something wrong with my calibration, right? Monitor calibration, right? So various aspects. So what I would suggest is obviously do some color correction, but don't add extra fins and extra eyes to the fish, right? Make it don't get carried away that you can add an extra eye using a cloning tool, right? Or don't get carried away that you can add so much red to the fish that it makes it much better, right? So yeah, so I think it's more of controlling your instincts to kind of try and interpret how was the actual color of the fish, and can I do my processing to kind of bring it close to that, right? Obviously there are photos where I completely remove the background because there are too many distractions. Like for example, I shoot a fish and there's a fish at the back which is yawning, right? But that's not the subject of that photo, right? So then I kind of airbrush it with a kind of black color, right? So the idea is obviously that you don't meddle too much with the subject of the fish, but you can remove all the distractions. That is my philosophy. I don't know if there's a international guideline on how you should process photos, but that's what I think of when I'm processing photos.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I will go to the questions. I think a few questions there. We'll start with the Dr. Radhakrishna's first question. Can you explain a little bit more on the photo tank? Is it portable, ready-made to take easy photos?
Yeah, so photo tank, I have typically it fit that role, right? Which is probably 3.5 inches deep, right? So you ask your aquarium guy to make that tank with silicon with ultra clear glass, right? And you should be able to get it done, right? I can there'll be a lot of reference photos of photo tanks on the net. If not, I can send it as well. But it's basically a shallow tank, probably I can say 6 inches long, probably 4 to 5 inches tall, and 3.5 inches deep, right? So the advantage is obviously you wrap it in bubble wrap, put it in your bag and carry it wherever you go, right? And typically what we do is we carry one bag of washed stones and sand. So when we go to a river, we put the sand, we take some water, either from drinking water we use, because if that the river water is not clear, fish photograph, right? So it's a very quick setup shoot kind of a scenario, right? And you can use sunlight, right? Obviously when you shoot, the sun should always be behind you, right? Just remember that, or you'll be casting shadows whatever you're shooting, right? Unless you're doing a silhouette effect, the sun or the source of light should always be behind you, or right, when you're shooting for a photo tank. But the environment, like, but when you're shooting in, for example, in my fish room, I have glass on all sides of my fish room, which means that I'll always have glare, right? So I can never project light from the front, right? So photo tank, yeah, I'm probably I can go back to that slide where I had it. Yeah, this one, right? So you can see it's a very shallow tank. Not a very tall tank either, not a long tank either, right? So typical fish, I don't know what you will catch. Obviously, you can't fit in your labio or neolisocylus or tors and all this tank. But as long as it's within like 5 inches or so, you can put it in this tank and quickly photograph. Yeah, hope I answered that question.
Yeah, I think that's another question. I think you probably answered that. What's an appropriate size of a photo tank, both for home use and field use? I think you covered that as well. Another question is there any camera or system where automatically the F and ISO are adjusted once we take photo, depending on the focus and natural light?
Um, I think there is one system where after shooting the photograph, you can change it. I forgot the name. I forgot the name of that system. There is one system which lets you do that, but it's not a very traditional looking camera, right? But what I would suggest is, you can do some bracketing for your aperture and all that, right? Like for example, instead of when you do bracketing, it means that you have a setting in your camera. You can shoot at, for example, one f-stop down, one f-stop up, so you can cover an aperture range, right? So you can do that. Or very simple thing, put it in auto mode and shoot, right, on your camera, right, till you get used to it. But I would always say, kind of graduate towards shooting on manual. That's when you have complete control over, what you want to do, right? What you want that end product to be, right? Or else till then you can, shoot in the auto mode. Most of them do a great job even in the auto mode, right? It's just that it doesn't let you control much, right? But that is something you can, like I would say, you could graduate from auto mode to either a shutter priority or an aperture priority mode to a manual mode, right? That if you're start with auto mode, then either go to shutter or aperture priority mode and then move on to manual.
Yeah. Another question is, can you give some tips to take photos in the wild? It's more general question.
See, I don't have tips for taking great photos, right? Because it's up to you and it's all subjective. Like for example, a photo that I like, somebody else will not like, right? So important thing is to set your own standards on what you like, right? Like for example, I am interested in capturing more and more how a fish lives in the wild, how the fish looks in the wild. So I have graduated toward underwater photography. Similarly, I'm not a taxonomist or something like that, right? I'm not an ichthyologist. So it's not always that I want to do a scale count based on my photo or do some meristics based on it, right? Or doing any, spine count or anything like that, right? So I'm more interested on the behavioral part of the fish. So I always try and see to capture the mood of the fish, whether it is a yawn, it is a, kind of like aggression, or it is a movement and things like that, right? So, it's like, you move to that early slide that I had, right, when I talked about, let me quickly move to that. Yeah. Oops. Yeah. What do you want to capture, right? It's up to that. What is your interest, right? Somebody wants to study the pattern, you can do that. Somebody wants to study, the physical features, you can do that, right? So it's up to you. I mean, as long as you like it, it's good photography. Even if it is blurred, if you think that's a good effect, it's a good effect, right? So that's how I see it, right? But obviously, if it is for a purpose, then you need to figure out what makes the purpose. Do you want the entire fish in focus, right? Then it's a good photo for for it to be in a publication, right? So only a few set of my photos go into publications because I don't typically try and capture right from the tip of the nose till the caudal fin, right? That I don't keep everything in focus, and I'm not very bothered about it, right? But whenever I have to contribute to a paper of a description of a fish, then I have to kind of make sure that everything is in focus. That's how it works.
Yeah, the next question is actually linked to that. You have not shown any fully focused photograph in your slides. It may be maybe like you must be concentrating on problems that may arise practically. But I think, don't you think the taking the full length of the fish is actually become more challenging than taking, focusing on certain areas or some behavior?
The problem with that full length photo, right? Typically, I see it is like a fish that is frozen. right? Sometimes you don't get, like for example, if this puffer photo that I taken, the main focus of that photo is those dentures, right? Those teeth, right? And that is what I'm looking for when I'm capturing that photo. Obviously, I have 10 other photos capturing the whole body, right? But if you ask me which photo did I like the most, which photo that I'm proud of taking, it is this photo, right? Because it kind of shows that moment in time when I don't know who will get the opportunity. Probably if I went half an hour later, I wouldn't have been able to capture this photo. Who knows, right? So it becomes an important photo for me, right? So again, as I said, it is more on what is your goals of photography, right? Is your goal in photography to have well detailed pictures so that somebody can take a look at it and count the scales and tell you what fish this is, right? Or have a look at the lateral line of the fish, right? Then the purpose becomes different, right? Like, or do you want to make it like a field guide, right? That I take it to the field, I see the photo, full length photo, and I can identify a fish, right? So, do you want to make it a part of your field guide? So, I mean, it all depends on your goals, right? Ideally, if I was a beginner and I started, I would have enjoyed having a definitely a book like that which showed all some things like that, right? But now I don't typically need it because if I see the fish, I can typically identify it. If I can't identify it, I send it to my ichthyologist friends, right? So that's how it works. So again, as I said, it's all up to you. How you want to do that.
Yeah, one question is Rama species you have shown, is it from Western Ghats or Northeast?
It's from the northeast.
Northeast, yeah. Well, we have two questions from one of the board member, Pradesh. He is asking, can you explain how it was when we choose a camera lens? And the second question, what do you follow when you compose a photo or fish or a setup like the cropping rule, keeping 1/3 or something like that? So that sort of thing.
Yeah, I try often to do kind of the rule of the third, but it doesn't work typically. Okay, and the reason being, especially with fast-moving fishes, you don't have time for composition. If you wait for composition, the fish goes out of the frame, right? So what I typically do is I aim for composition, but sometimes I go for cropping to get what I wanted, right? That's how I would typically do, right? I do aggressively crop sometimes. Sometimes I'm just happy. I look at the photo and I'm happy with the output. Then I see there is no distraction. Then I go with that, right? I'm happy with it. So I don't go so much by the rule, yeah, but yes, I do try and do some composition, but largely it doesn't work for me, right? That's what I've encountered. Because if you noticed in all my photo settings, the shutter speed is quite low, right? 1/60 and all that, right? 1/160 and all that. So yeah, that's how it works for me.
There are yeah, Dr. Radhakrishnan is it's a video demonstration would be good. So I think you can bring something in your next talk.
Yeah, a video, I don't know, might be difficult because I don't know who will shoot the video for me. Probably I can get one of my friends to shoot. Yeah, but we can try and do that. Probably, I don't know, when COVID is over, I would love to do like a workshop, right, on photography to show how we shoot as well. But yeah, it's a good idea. We can definitely try that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I missed a question on the lens, right? What lens to choose?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say a faster lens is one definitely that you would look for, and definitely you'd need to look for, like, I go for 100 mm macro because I shoot a lot of small fishes, the Danionellas, the Darios, the Brachygobius, and so on, right? So I need to get really close to actually get the features of the fish, right? So I would suggest go for 100 mm macro so you can move back if it's too big for your frame or something like that, right? So definitely I would recommend that. And lens, I use Canon, but I mean you can use Tamron or any of those lenses as well. They are pretty good. Especially if I remember, the Tamron 90 mm macro is a pretty good lens, so you can try that. But as I
Yes.
said, right, invest more on the lens. You won't regret it.
Yeah. Something related. So your preference to stick with Canon lens, or do you use other brand for a cheaper lens?
Yeah, yeah. My family is very supportive, so I don't want to test them by buying a camera every year, a lens every year, right? Already I spend a lot of money on camera. For my underwater photography, I have an Olympus PG6, I have a Sony A6400, I have a GoPro, right? So I would love to buy a lot of lenses. No, but I'm at this state. I feel that with this one lens that I have, mostly I can achieve what I want through that, right? So I'm kind of I'm satisfied with that, and I have a very expensive hobby, which is aquarium fishes. So yeah, if I had more money, definitely I would.
Yeah. So there are two questions. One, actually, how much initial investment was someone would need to get started with, standard things, or yeah.
Yeah, see, what I would recommend is when you start off, buy second hand, right? You can, I don't know, most of you will have some friend who's good at photography. Look at second hand camera, second hand lens, and start with that, right? The reason I'm also saying is that a lot of the photography hobbyists, just like how people change their phone every year, they change their lens and camera every year, right? So you will get a lot of good cameras and lenses in the market just because they're like a 2 years released 2 years earlier or something like that, right? So I would say first look at there are some marketplaces which sell second-hand cameras and second-hand lens. Look there, OLX as well, but sometimes it's not very reliable, so you might want somebody to help you kind of evaluate what you're buying. But I would say within say around say 25 to 30K, you should be able to set up with a camera body, a camera lens, and I'm talking about a DSLR. Okay, so I'm not talking about a point and shoot. You can start with those things, right? So camera, what you have to look at is how many clicks it has taken, right? The more number of clicks, lesser is its life, right? For lenses, you will have to look at any chromatic aberrations, scratches, dust, fungus, and so on, right? Those are the things that you need to look out for, right? And especially when it comes to autofocus, you need to make sure the autofocus motor is working, right? Or else you will be stuck with manual focus. So those are the things that you need to look at when you buy secondhand. But definitely there are good options secondhand. And let me frankly tell you that even 10 years back, I used to take good photos. A lot of the photos that I took 10 years back are better than some photos that I've taken recently, right? So trust in yourself more than in your gadgets, right? And most of you are posting photos into like social media and so on, or Facebook, are posting there. You don't have to worry about how many pixels, how many megapixels the camera is and all that, right? Don't worry about all that. See how good the sensor is, how good the sensitivity is, and go with that instead.
You reminded me about something, when you post pictures in Facebook or via social media, most people ask you what camera you have. And I kind of feel awkward, don't you trust about my photographic techniques? You know, people never think about it, because they always first thing is the ability of the camera rather than it's your, technical ability. Don't have you ever thought about that? Like, when people ask you that question.
Yeah, since I work in the IT industry, probably it's a good question to ask. Probably like 3 or 4 years down the line, because most likely artificial intelligence will take over, and they will take your cameras will come with artificial intelligence, and they'll take better photos than you, right? But as of today, there's still a lot of dependency on your skill as a photographer to kind of capture the right mode, right? So even whatever camera you have, there is still a bit of skill set that rests in you, right? So while that question is valid, that question should be asked like what AI engine you use, right? Probably in 2024 or 2025, you can ask that question. What AI engine do you use? Right? That'll be a good question. Till then, you can ask Deepak, how did you take that photo?
Yeah, someone asked about the photo tank, what kind of glass it is, or do you use acrylic? I mean, it's a general question. Can you use acrylic? And
Yeah,
I have some planted tanks, and I have heard about the low end glass, which gives you more clarity. So I think that's the what you were talking about ultra clear or something. Yeah.
Yes. Ultra clear, I guess, is the kind of brand name or trade name that they use. But basically, what you need is low iron glass, which does not add color to the glass. So one of the easy ways to find out is that if you look at it from the side, right, where it's polished and so on, it should be clear. Or else you get that greenish kind of tinge in high iron glass kind of a thing, right? So as for low iron glass, see, acrylic is good, but the one of the main disadvantage of acrylic is that they can get easily scratched, right? Because they're a softer material, right? They're more easy to transport, but they can get easily scratched, right? The disadvantage of glass is obviously they will not survive as much in terms of breakage. They are more delicate, right? They're more susceptible to be broken, right? But less susceptible to be scratched as much as acrylic, I would say. So I would say, start off with a photo tank which is low iron glass, somewhere along those dimensions. Any of your aquarium should be able to do it. Just make sure that they don't do a mess with your silicon sealant, like in that photo that I showed you, or else it becomes difficult to photograph, right? Or it kind of gives you a lot of work to kind of clean it up. Where is that photo? Yeah, this one, right? Okay, I went too fast. So you can see a lot of the silicon sealant on the side, right? It should be neat, right? And not like you are doing some masonry work, right? It should be very neat, clean lines, so it'll actually help you get a better photo.
Kavita Kumari would like you to elaborate on what actually is a macro lens.
Macro lens will actually help you get closer to the subject. Like for example, if you want to photograph a coin, you can use a macro lens, right? So macro lens typically doesn't give you the versatility of being able to zoom in and out and so on.
Yeah, someone asked the first photo you remember when you asked about the most difficult fish to capture.
What is the most difficult of fish to catch?
I mean, what do you remember, like your first photo?
To photograph, you mean? Okay, photograph. Just give me a minute. Let me. Running out of battery.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So my first camera was a Sony MVCD 300. So it's the gift from my brother. It used to have a compact disc inside. And obviously when I started out shooting any fast moving fishes, like when I started, it was I think I started digital photography in around 2000 or something like that. So at that point, these couldn't handle all the fast moving fishes like tetras, right? I used to have some of those tetras back in those days, right? So I was never able to photograph those kind of fishes earlier, right? But right now, my challenge in photography is definitely I have a shortage in time because I have a full-time job, so I can't sit in front of the tank. So a lot of fishes that I keep are hill stream fishes, which like to hide a lot, right? Like there are some fishes that I only see 3 to 4 times a year, right? Because they are either nocturnal fishes or they are fishes which live under rocks in the wild, right? In hill streams, right? So definitely those are the fishes. It's very difficult for me because I suddenly see them out. Then I scamper to go and get my camera, and by the time I'm back, that's gone, and it's another 3 months till I see that fish again, right? So those are the fishes that I typically, when I get them, I take a photo in the photo tank, and then I leave in the tank because I know I won't be able to kind of photograph them for another year or so, right? Yeah, that's typical challenges that you see.
Yeah.
And there are other fishes like, for example, Olaira, some of the amblysepts, which are very fast-moving hill stream catfishes. They go mad, right? The typical way of getting them out is to feed. So I add some worms into the water, but then they move so fast, head over heels, and it's like most of the photos is just like a blur, like that matrix effect you will get of a fin moving all around the screen, right? So yeah, those are also quite challenging. Some of these unpredictable, fast-moving fishes.
There are two tank questions. One is all side molded glass would be better than silicon pasted ones. That's the question. And someone asked about the thickness of the glass.
Okay. So let's say the molded tanks, I don't like it at all. Okay, the reason why, because there is a lot of distortion around the edges. So these are basically, I think most of these are built in China. So they use, they actually heat it up and bend the glass, kind of like a U shape, and there is a back glass which is straight. So all around the edges, you will see there is a lot of distortion, which means that viewing is a problem. While it looks a bit pretty in terms of the curves and all that, I think for me, it's not worth it. I will never have a those molded tanks. Okay. And in terms of what glass thickness to use, like my 8-foot tanks where I keep my barbs, for example, I have probably a 12 toughened glass, which is basically you have your regular, regular glass, and then they are heated to a very high degree to make it toughened. So that's the glass that I use. I do have a tank inside my house, which is like probably a 900-liter tank, which is like a 7-foot, but it's a 2.5-foot high that I keep my discus and ultims. That tank is actually a 19 glass because I don't want my kids kind of knocking over. So it's about safety as well, right? So a couple of things to consider, right? When you're building a tank is one, do you have a level surface on which you're keeping, right? That is very, very critical, right? Whatever, glass thickness you put, when there is pressure on any specific area because of an uneven surface, you're going to have a problem, right? Because all the water pressure is going towards the bottom, and from the bottom, because of your uneven surface, there are certain points of your bottom glass which are getting too much pressure, right? So definitely make sure that you have a cushioning layer, which is like you can use either a rubber sheet or styrofoam to kind of help with that. But make sure both your floor level as well as your tank stand level is perfect. There are no, there are no inconsistencies there, right? Next, we need to come to the glass. It also depends on height. The taller glass you go, you need more stronger glass, right? Long and shallow glass doesn't need as much thicker glass as a tall tank, right? So there are calculators that are available on the net where you can input your tank size and it'll give you a recommended, a glass thickness, right? Also think of, if you are going like compromising on the glass thickness, make sure you have enough bracing on your tank, right? The bracing actually holds your bottom, the sides of your glass together, right? That kind of gives you an additional strength, right? So, but then don't be dependent on it. That's only an additional layer of protection. But typically make sure that you're using the right thickness of glass for the, the volume of water and the height of the tank.
So what about for these photo tank?
Photo tank, photo tanks I use 4 glass. Sorry if you were actually meaning photo tank and I kind of rambled about aquarium tanks, but 4 is more than enough.
Yeah, one question with the underwater stuff. How to capture egg and larvae photos in the wild? Have you ever done that?
No, I have captured, a fish. I don't know if you are familiar with the Pseudotoplus maculatus, which is called as orange chromate, very common in Kerala and all that as well. That fish I've captured with fry, right? But I have not been able to capture the eggs and things like that. I've not been able. I have videos of them, like for example, Atropolis canarensis protecting their eggs and all that. I have videos, but then problem is also I usually snorkel, right? I snorkel and shoot, which means that I am underwater, I'm viewing it underwater, then I have my camera. It's a very, very uncomfortable position to shoot, especially because the water is cold. You typically, after some time, feel your body freezing up, and there is no bed layer, right? It's usually your body is resting on some rocks, right? So it kind of probably I'm not yet to that stage where I can spend a lot of time underwater to shoot. That's when you can kind of identify nesting sites, go near and shoot, right? So right now I don't have anything, but definitely if I get an opportunity in future, I can try that. But also remember, when you are shooting, things like egg and all that, you actually have to focus on a very small object, which means that you need additional light, right? And you need a camera which has a macro lens, right? Only then you can do it. I use Olympus TG6, which has got a microscopic lens, right? It's a point and shoot, but it has a microscopic lens, so you can actually get quite close and shoot it. But still, I would say that it is a kind of challenging thing to shoot those.
Yeah, hopefully we can hear more of that stories in another talk.
Yeah.
So that's everything in the chat box. But if I will allow maybe one or two questions, if anyone would like to come, unmute, and if you want to ask a question, now is the time.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Beta, I'm Dr. Radhakrishnan here. In fact, I feel this is a very relevant topic now because photographing of fish is an important one for taxonomy even. And nowadays, if you see most of the taxonomic literature available, the taxonomic books available in the library, there is no color photographs. So students are every time asking, sir, with these photographs, only diagrams, how to identify the fish? Because if you are giving the correct natural colored photograph, then it would be very easy. And also even some of the photographs, as you shown, the fin counts, ray counts, and even the scale counts can easily be taken from the photograph itself.
Yeah.
So I especially, because I'm specialized in taxonomy and working in Northeast India, what I have seen here is there is no book even having a taxonomic having good photographs of the fishes. So it's very relevant. I greatly appreciate you. Please cooperate with me or us and also other taxonomists to bring out some beautiful books on taxonomy of fishes in India. Maybe you might have been already working on it.
Yeah. So I have contributed.
Thank you very much for the contribution.
Yeah. I mean, I feel your pain because see, when I started out, there is very less interest in Indian native fishes among hobbyists, right? There's a very small group, and typically I had to, depend on the AGK Menon's checklist of freshwater fishes, then Casey Jairam's book, Dr. Casey Jairam's book, right? So those only had photos of your, drawings, right? So it was very challenging. So it's slowly over the years that I actually kind of learned to, identify fishes and so on. And even now, the photos that you see, a lot of it is the preserved specimens, right? That you put it in formalin or ethanol, right? It looks more like a fossil or like an alien creature sometimes if you have not preserved it well, because those preservation artifacts are there, right? Which doesn't give a very good idea of actually how the fish looks. So definitely, yeah, I've actually contributed few pictures to some books. Hopefully, they'll be out. I think I have a couple of ones coming out for some northeast fishes, right? So we'll definitely do that. So I'm always happy to contribute because I don't charge anybody any money for use of my photos as long as it's not commercial use. Because my passion is to kind of create awareness of Indian native fishes. So you've seen that most of my photographs are on Indian native fishes, right? So definitely I will contribute with anyone who shares my passion on Indian native fishes.
Right. Thank you for the, in fact, we have to collaborate because we cannot be so perfect like you, because photograph, if you are including in a publication, it should be, what I feel is it should be perfect. So of course we cannot be a good photographer at the same time. So better, yes, more collaboration is very important.
I think one is also to create awareness among the public, right? Nobody is going to get
very right.
The public if they just see a drawing or a preserved specimen, but when they actually see something colorful, they can at least relate to it and say, oh, such a beautiful fish. Like just imagine Dennis, if you put a photo of a preserved specimen, it'll be just like a white lump and they'll see chalamine or something like that, right? Or nethylamine, they will think, right? But when you actually see the the photos when they appreciate, wow, what a colorful fish that is living in in our rivers, right? So yeah, definitely I take that point from you. Definitely we can collaborate.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Radhakrishnan. That's a good point there, and I think and there's another platform, Beta. Then this everyone here is from a fish background, and probably most of them are Indian. So you have been introduced to a wonderful group, and there will be opportunity. People will be approaching you for help with their work and everything. And yeah, so and can you show us the last slide again if anyone want to contact you?
Yeah, I'll also share my email ID on the chat in case you
Yeah.
want somebody.
Yeah. So thanks everyone for joining today. Don't forget to give your feedback. The feedback link was there in the I'll just put it again. And yeah, in next 2 weeks we'll have another talk. So till then, goodbye and thanks, Vita, for sharing your time.